Right now, somewhere in this country, a family is sitting on $150,000 in savings and calling it protected. They're not, they're bleeding, slowly, invisibly, and without a single alarm going off. You've probably heard the same advice your parents did: keep cash accessible, have a cushion. Money in the bank is safe money, and for a generation that watched markets collapse, that advice felt like wisdom. It felt responsible, conservative, earned. But here's what nobody in that room bothered to calculate: what no well-meaning relative, no financial brochure, no savings account welcome letter ever told you: holding excess cash isn't protection. It's a silent tax. One you never agreed to pay. One that sends no bill, leaves no receipt, and appears nowhere on your monthly statement. But it has been collecting from your family every single month. And in 2026, with inflation running persistently above 3% and traditional savings accounts yielding less than 1%, the amount it's taking is not small. In the next few minutes, you're going to see the exact math most families never sit down to run. You're going to recognize at least one pattern in how your own household holds cash, a pattern that's costing real money with no dramatic moment to mark the loss. And by the end, you'll understand a framework that separates families who genuinely preserve wealth across generations from families who hand their children an account balance that looks the same, but buys 40% less. Stay with this. There's a specific calculation toward the end that doesn't just make sense. It changes how you read every savings account statement from this point forward. Here's the number the banking industry doesn't put in the brochure. That gap between 3% inflation and sub 1% yield, that quiet space between two numbers most people have never placed side by side, is where your family's purchasing power disappears. Every month that gap stays open is a month the silent tax collected, not risk-free returns, not protection, a monthly charge on capital you thought you were safeguarding. And the insidious part, the account still shows the same number, so nothing feels wrong. That's precisely why this is dangerous. Let's run the actual math that most people never calculate. A family holding $150,000 in traditional savings, not for 3 months, not for 6, but as a permanent cushion that just feels responsible, loses approximately $4,500 per year in real purchasing power. That's not a projection built on assumptions. That's the arithmetic of 3% inflation against a sub 1% yield, every year, automatically, invisibly. Over a decade, that's $45,000 in wealth your family worked for, saved for, made sacrifices for, quietly evaporated. Over 2 decades, the window of a single wealth transfer timeline, you're approaching $100,000 in real value that simply ceases to exist. The account will still read $150,000, but in 20 years, that $150,000 will buy what $90,000 buys today. The number survived, the wealth didn't. And the statement never showed the loss, which is exactly why so many families carry it for so long without noticing. Now, there are 3 specific patterns that indicate a family is actively bleeding capital, and most households match at least one of them, sometimes without any awareness at all. The first is what happens when an emergency fund quietly becomes something else. Financial literacy education recommends 3 to 6 months of expenses in liquid savings. That's sound, proven, necessary advice, but fear doesn't operate on sound advice. Markets get volatile, headlines get loud. And what began as a 6-month cushion stretches to 12, then 18, then 24, because every time you think about moving the excess, something in the news makes you hesitate. That excess, everything above a genuine 6-month reserve, isn't an emergency fund anymore. It's fear wearing the clothing of financial planning. For a family with $4,000 in monthly expenses, the difference between a $24,000 emergency reserve and an $80,000 emergency reserve is $56,000 sitting in an account collecting 0.8%, while inflation extracts 3% annually. That's over $1,200 per year in silent tax on money held for a sense of safety that math doesn't actually support. It doesn't feel like a loss. That's the trap. The second pattern is harder to recognize because it sounds perfectly rational in the moment. It's cash held while waiting. A family receives an inheritance, a business deal closes, a property sells, And rather than deploying that capital, they park it temporarily while they wait for the market to settle. Wait for rates to stabilize. Wait for clarity that never quite arrives on schedule. Here is the problem with waiting: inflation doesn't wait. While you're watching conditions, inflation is watching your account. Every week of "we'll figure this out soon" is purchasing power your family will never recover. Capital parked at 0.8% while inflation runs at 3% loses real value every single day. Not metaphorically, mathematically. And those months don't refund themselves when you finally decide to move. The research on market timing is consistent and brutal. The cost of waiting for the right moment almost always exceeds the cost of entering at the wrong one. Time in the market compounds. Time outside the market drains. The third pattern is the one families talk about least, because it's wrapped in something far more complicated than money. Inheritance hoarding. An adult child receives a significant liquid inheritance, $80,000, $120,000, sometimes more, representing decades of a parent's work, discipline, and sacrifice. And they put it in savings, to be careful, to honor the gift, to not do something reckless with money that carried so much meaning. The intention is respect, the outcome is erosion. Without deliberate redeployment, an inheritance parked in a traditional savings account loses 30 to 40% of its real value within a single generation. The parent worked 30 years to build that. The child preserved the number. The wealth quietly disappeared, and no one was reckless, no one made a bad decision, no one failed. They just didn't do the maths. And here's the part that tends to land differently once you hear it. That inheritance wasn't just money, it was time. Someone's working years compressed into an account balance. Letting inflation silently drain that account isn't playing it safe. It's allowing that time to expire. At this point, the picture looks stark. 3 patterns, all invisible in daily life, all compounding in real time, all rooted in behavior that feels genuinely responsible. Emergency funds grown too large from fear. Capital delayed by the illusion of perfect timing. Inheritances preserved in number but not in value. And the families caught in these patterns aren't reckless. They're doing exactly what they were told, exactly what feels careful, exactly what 2 generations of advice says is the smart move. That's what makes the silent tax so effective. It specifically targets people who are trying to be careful. Here's the reframe that changes how you see this. The families who actually preserve wealth across generations, not those who inherited it, but those who deliberately protect and transfer it, don't think about cash as safe or risky. They think about it as a tool with a specific job, and a tool that isn't doing its job isn't neutral. It's a liability. This is the foundation of what can be called the 70-30 protection framework. Not a portfolio strategy, not an aggressive investment philosophy, but a structure for thinking about how family capital is positioned. 70% of family capital stays actively deployed in inflation-resistant vehicles, diversified across assets that generate income, maintain real value, or both. This doesn't mean speculation. It doesn't require volatility. It means capital is working rather than waiting. 30% remains in liquid reserves but tiered. A smaller portion is genuinely liquid, accessible within days for true emergencies. A larger portion sits in instruments that yield meaningfully more than inflation while remaining accessible within 30 to 90 days. High-yield savings accounts. Short-duration treasury instruments, money market funds, not exotic, not complex, just not passive. The gap between this structure and a traditional savings account approach isn't dramatic in any single month. But compounded over 20 years, it's the difference between an account that shows $150,000 and buys $150,000 worth of goods, and one that shows $150,000 and buys $90,000. The number looks identical, the wealth is not. What shifts when you internalize this framework isn't your account balance, it's how you read account statements. You stop seeing $150,000 in savings as a fixed safe position. You start seeing it as capital with a yield, a cost, and a function, one of which may be working for your family and one of which may be quietly working against it. You stop asking, "Is this safe?" and start asking, "What job is this capital doing, and is it earning enough to justify its position?" That's the mental model that wealth-preserving families operate from, not the question, how do I keep this? But how do I deploy this so its real value survives the next 2 decades? The difference isn't access to better investments. It's a framework that treats idle capital as having a measurable cost because it does. The cost is called purchasing power loss, and it compounds. The conversation about protecting family wealth almost always centers on what to buy, where to invest, which assets to hold. But the real threat to most American family balance sheets isn't bad investment decisions. It's good intentions sitting in accounts yielding less than inflation. The families who recognize this, who run the math, identify the patterns, and restructure how they hold capital, don't just protect wealth for themselves. They change what their children actually receive, not the number, the real value. If this calculation shifted how you see your own cash position, that discomfort is worth sitting with. The 3 patterns, overflow, delay, and inheritance hoarding, don't announce themselves. They just quietly bill you every month. The question now isn't whether you've been paying. The question is whether you're going to keep paying.